So welcome to the Gender Identification Initiative panel at Let's Go Digital, hosted by A2IM. We're all very excited to be here today and to present to you on this really important issue. So my name is Monica Corton, and I'm the CEO and founder of Go to 11 Entertainment, which is a new equity-funded music publishing company that also offers our clients social media services, branding, and we have a special artist services division that's going to be working on targeted album projects. On the panel, we have a very distinguished group of people. And so let's just do introductions initially for all those here. So first, Mark, would you like to tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Hi, everybody. So my name is Mark Isherwood. I'm currently part of the Secretariat for Digital Data Exchange LLC, DDEX. DDEX is a standards organization operating in the music industry, and the focus of the standards that we develop are on communicating metadata up and down the various different avenues of the digital music value chain. Our membership, we're a membership organization, and our membership is made up of companies from right across the value chain, from musical work collecting societies, music publishers, record companies, distributors, record company and performer societies, digital service providers, technology service providers, and companies who operate in the studio environment on providing platforms for creators. And before that, I was at MCPS, PRS in the UK, one of the bigger collecting societies.
Great. Maxie, would you like to tell us a little bit about your background?
Yes, for sure. Thank you. It's rad to be here. I'm Maxie. I am a European project manager at Secretly Group, which is a group of labels and a distribution company. I have a roster of artists that I work with on release campaigns focusing on Europe. And it's an amazing roster, lots of women and gender minorities, and very diverse in all respects. So I've been there only a couple of months. And before that, I worked at Key Change, which is a movement for gender equality in the music industry, and perhaps what I will be talking most about today. I'm also a drummer. I play drums in a couple of bands, and I host queer dance parties here in London. So lots of, well, fingers in lots of pies. Yeah, it's great to be here. I think at the core, an advocate for equality and equity in the music industry. So look forward to chatting.
Excellent. And Andreea?
Hi, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here next to these fantastic speakers. My name is Andreea Magdalina. I'm the founder and CEO of SheSaidSo, which is a global community of women and gender minorities in the music industry. It's a community that I built whilst I was still living in London. I'm currently in LA. And in addition to that, I've been working at the intersection of music and technology with companies such as Mixcloud, Microsoft, Skype, and a few other clients in the advertising space. That's me.
Great. So the Gender Identification Initiative started several months ago because I saw this fabulous presentation at Women in Music and all these diverse organizations, primarily led by women, who were doing fantastic work in their own realm. So they were all doing these presentations, and I realized that their work had no way of being quantified through data because we as an industry do not identify gender in any aspect of what we do through our data systems. And so I gathered 10 of the organizations to see if they would be interested in using our collective power, for lack of a better word, to try to rectify this and find a way to be able to clearly identify when women and other underserved communities are in the chain of performing, of releasing records, of charting, of winning awards, of getting licensing in film and television and video games, all the different aspects that we measure for success that we can then measure by gender as well. And the 10 organizations that are part of the initiative are the Asian American Collective, Change the Conversation, Diversify the Stage, Gender Amplified, Maestra Music, She is the Music, SheSaidSo, We Are Moving the Needle, Women in Control, and Women in Music. And it's been wonderful to all sort of join our forces to try and make real change in the music industry. So our idea was to try and capture this gender information on the publishing side and the label side. On the publishing side, we've been working with the MLC because our data partner is Chartmetric, and Chartmetric now has access to publishing data because of the open API that exists as part of the Music Modernization Act and part of the mandate of the MLC. On the label side, we went directly to Mark because we wanted to find out what existed in the standards for label information that might allow us to include gender as part of the data that's provided in the data systems. And Mark, why don't you tell us a little bit about what DDEX has been doing on that front?
Sure. I'm going to just focus on a couple of elements, or 2 or 3 elements within DDEX. There are in fact 11 families of standards within DDEX, and each one of those is used between different types of business partners within the whole music industry value chain. So for example, there's one for exchanging data between record companies and DSPs like Spotify and Apple and so on. And then there are several others to be used for music rights societies, for musical works, for music publishers, for music licensing companies like Sound Exchange in the US, and so on and so on. But there are 2 standards that are particularly relevant to this discussion. One is called MEAD, Media Enrichment and Description. And the second one is called PI, Party Identification and Enrichment. And these 2 standards were developed specifically to enable communication of rich non-core data. So what do I mean by non-core data? I mean the data about the musical works, the sound recordings, the releases, and the parties, the contributors involved in all of this, which has nothing to do with rights management or supply chain requirements. So it could be things like how many Grammys an artist has won, which other artists has a producer worked with, a journal article on a recent concert by an artist. All of these kinds of things that are simply not necessary for the purposes of rights management and supply chain activity. These are about creating a much richer and involved experience for us as consumers. One of the things in the early days of streaming in particular was the limit of the data that the consumers saw. Mostly it was just the album title, the track title, and the artist, and maybe durations of the tracks if you were lucky. What the DSPs are now insisting on is a much, much richer amount of data. So not just the artists, but the writers, the engineers, the producers, other members of the band who are perhaps playing in the background, and that they want that data so that we as consumers can sort of follow our noses through by clicking through and saying, well, I really like the way this has been produced. What other artists has this producer worked with? Oh, he's worked with this artist. I'm going to listen to these tracks. And gradually the intention of that is that, you know, our experience becomes richer. We engage more and more with the streaming services, and obviously, hopefully consume more, and that generates more royalties for everybody concerned. And so obviously a key part of that is gender. And in the PI standard, there is gender information. There's an XML tag. Technical bit doesn't really matter. It's just it's a piece in the standard for gender, which is defined as the gender of the party based on self-identification. And we have agreed a number of values, which I've listed there: male, female, non-binary, non-stated, prefer, not to say, unknown, and user defined. And so we are gradually moving towards enabling this kind of data to be communicated, not just between record companies and the DSPs, but throughout the whole value chain. There are a couple of things that have to be taken into account. This tag is not mandatory, and it's not mandatory because in a lot of cases, the data simply won't exist. The only way this data is going to exist if the creators, be they artists, writers, engineers, producers, whatever they are, insist by contract that what they self-identify at is a piece of data that is made available. And in that context, the gender tag also contains an attribute that says do not display, because there may be circumstances where an artist or creator, whoever it happens to be, is happy for the DSP to know their self-identification in terms of gender, but they don't want it displayed to consumers. So you could have circumstances where somebody says, play me a track from a female jazz singer, and the DSP can then actually service that request without the actual gender that the individual concerned has self-identified with.
Mark, can a person, so say somebody's gender fluid and they initially sign as a woman, but then they decide to change to they, is it possible to make that change in the values in the PI standard?
As long as they make the change with the person that they have a contract with, yes, you should be able to update the information on a person, over time. And these are very much, sort of fluid in the sense that as more and more information becomes available or is created, excuse me, then that is made available to DSP. So it's not a once and for all activity.
Right, and the DDEX standards are the standards that all the streaming services use now. Correct?
Yeah, pretty much. I'm not saying every single 100% is using these, but almost all labels, almost all distributors like, Believe and Fuga and all those companies are using it and sending data to DSPs. DSPs are using a different standard to send usage reports right across the world. And a whole bunch of other standards are being used in their individual sectors. And it gradually, it's a slow process, but it's gradually all coming along. So that to me is the most important standard as far as this sort of discussion is concerned, and getting that kind of data into the supply chain. But as I said, it's very incumbent on individuals requiring this data to be stored and be communicated. And one other standard that I would draw to your attention, where gender can also be captured, is in the Recording Information Notification Standard. And this is for capturing data in the studio or as very early in the process as possible. And then once it's captured, it can then be communicated into the value chain. At the moment, usually that will go to a record company, but there's no reason, given some of the developments that are going on that are outside of DDEX, but a number of technology companies are working on, that sort of the information from a RIN file should not go to a publisher or to a CMO. And it captures all kinds of data within the standard, including all of the participants, regardless of what their roles are, what type of creations were made. In other words, what were the musical works? What was the instrumentation used for a particular session, or even, part of a session? and down to quite granular information about the equipment that used, like microphones and mixing desk. So that's a very important standard and right at the beginning of the chain, if you like, and that is gradually being deployed in a number of door manufacturer platforms and other activities of that nature. So that's just a very quick sort of piece of information to set the scene in terms of what DDEX is doing in this space.
Great, thanks. So Maxie, can you talk a little bit about your work at Key Change and how Key Change intersects with the work that we're trying to do in the Gender Identification Initiative?
Absolutely, yeah. So I worked at PRS Foundation for 5 years, and back in 2011, PRS Foundation started working on positive action initiatives off the back of data actually from PRS for Music, which is the collection society that Mark has already mentioned. And PRS Foundation is the charitable arm of PRS for Music. So at that time, PRS told us that only 11% of their membership said they were women. And so back in 2011, we started a fund called Women Make Music to try to start to do something about that, to empower more women and gender minorities to come forward for funding, and ultimately to get involved in music and make music. And so that fund existed for a long time, and after 5 years we did an evaluation, and basically again used data to evaluate the success of the fund and also spot gaps in what more needed to change. And from that study, we found that there were many things that still needed to change, and a big focus was in shifting kind of organization representation. So not just focusing on individuals, although that was super important, as this fund was targeted in kind of individual support, so giving grants of up to £5,000 to individuals to make music. We realized that there needed to be a wider industry shift, and more organizations and music industry bodies taking responsibility and accountability for the change that needed to happen. So Key Change was founded in 2017, and it's funded by Creative Europe, and it's a big talent development program that was an international version of Women Make Music. So it's a network. Every year there are 74 women and gender minorities who take part in a talent development program where they showcase internationally. They take part in a capacity building program, and we partner with SheSaidSo on an awesome mentoring program too. So it has that kind of talent development focus where we're really trying to empower women and gender minorities to realize their potential and break through that glass ceiling, get to the next stage in their career. And as soon as we started this project, we worked with festivals who are partnered with us on the project to launch a pledge. And so this was the way that organizations could really start to address their inequality in their organization. And the pledge is basically a contract that over 500 music organizations now have with us, where they commit to achieving 50% representation of women and gender minorities in any area of their work. So it started with festivals, and that was kind of in response to who we were partnering with, but also in response to, I guess, what was a mainstream conversation back in 2017. And so we worked with festivals, we got festivals signed up to this pledge to start to address the imbalance on their lineups. So when you look at those posters and you see kind of who are the women and gender minorities on the poster and who are the men, often there's not many of the latter. So we started with festivals, and it's grown to include over 500 organizations from over 40 countries, and they report to us annually on the makeup of their organization, and of course the kind of the pool in which they're submitting data to us changes in every circumstance, but ultimately it's kind of the number of women and gender minorities in the area that you're focusing on for change. And I guess an important point is that it kind of relies on that self-identification that Mark was talking about. So it relies on the artists or the producers or the workers to tell the organization their gender and encourage them to submit that data to Key Change. So I think that's a really important point, that genders should not be assumed in this kind of data collection process. But yeah, I think that with Key Change, it's grown because that accountability and that responsibility has really shifted onto organizations in our activism. And one other big strand of what Key Change does, which influences that, is the manifesto. So it's a lot about advocacy, and every 4 years, Key Change takes a document, a manifesto, to European Parliament and sort of lobbies for areas in which gender equality could be improved.
And just to make people clear, because most of the people watching this are Americans, when you say that Key Change is funded by Creative Europe, that means the EU, right? This is,
yes,
that the government of Europe is funding diversity and actively helping to create more diverse communities in the music business, both at the festival level, the industry level, and in general, songwriters and artists.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's the Creative Europe Department of the European Commission. So it's a big pot of funding that is available. They have call-outs every few years. But I think it's important to say as well that Key Change has also influenced Creative Europe to start monitoring the gender in their funding calls. So there is a real kind of sense of increasing accountability and progress happening in that space. And yeah, and so it was amazing to connect with you, Monica, and talk about how that change could be reflected, and I guess how we can ensure that it's long lasting and meaningful change, and not just kind of on a superficial level in terms of kind of short-term representation, but this is something that we commit to integrating into our processes and into our data, so that we can accurately monitor and reflect the real life situation of the recording industry and the whole music industry. Because I think it's important to note that this is not just a digital problem. It's not just that the data isn't just a problem kind of digitally. I think that we need to kind of ensure that there is a demand for collecting this information at all levels, in kind of live contracts, for releasing records, in studios, like you've said, but kind of course, at the point that this information enters a digital environment, it's even more important. Yeah.
At the start. Andreea, can you tell us about SheSaidSo and how and why SheSaidSo wanted to get involved in the Gender Identification Initiative?
I created SheSaidSo at a time where there weren't any other organizations like SheSaidSo that I knew of at the time. I was based in London. I was working for Mixcloud, a music streaming service that at the time was still in startup mode. I was employee number 5 or 6. And so at the intersection of music and technology, both of which struggle with diversity and representation, as we know. And my idea was, to do something about it. There was no talk about diversity in the industry at that point. There was no talk about it in the media, or at least from my perspective. You know, I was in my mid-20s. I felt like I was having some meetings with women in the industry, and then when it came to making a decision, when it came to the decision-making part of the process, all of a sudden the woman disappeared from the conversation and she would be replaced, you know, often by an older white male. And so I started noticing these things after a while, and my solution to addressing this issue, as well as the fact that the music industry to me at that time felt very competitive and not, you know, necessarily a place that encourages people to collaborate with each other and support each other, you know, beyond gender itself, just as an industry. And so I was part of a similar community of women in tech called Ada's List, which inspired me to create SheSaidSo, a community for women in music. At the time, I didn't realize that women in music existed. Plus, I think it was very US focused, whereas I had no intentions at the time to be in the US. You know, turns out that I ended up here anyway, but you know, that's how life goes. And so the focus of SheSaidSo primarily to start with was on the women working behind the scenes, because we knew that there is some sort of relationship between what you see, what people see publicly on stage, you know, the artists, the music that they consume, and those working behind the scenes to bring that sort of experience to life. And we thought that if we increase the number of women in decision-making power roles, and just across the industry overall, that then increases the likelihood that, you know, what you see on stage will also be equally, you know, diverse and representative. So anyway, that there is a relationship between the two. And so we focused on putting together a community that invited women working behind the scenes. And, you know, fast forward 7 years to this present moment, we're still kind of in the same place, you know. At the very least, we're past the awareness stage. We've definitely created a lot of conversation about it. Many other communities like SheSaidSo have sprung up in the meantime. Initiatives like Key Change, you know, the press is listening, the governments are listening and are making diversity and inclusion a priority in some way. You know, some are putting their money on it, some aren't, but there's definitely conversation about it. And we're pretty deep into the solutions phase, but we're not at a stage where we can see considerable results just yet. You know, the representation of women in general has increased in the industry, has improved. But when you start digging, you know, deeper through the data and you look at specific markets, if you look at specific verticals within the industry, if you start looking at the boards and so on, if you start looking at the gender pay gap, which in the UK, companies over 100 employees are required by law to disclose those numbers. Again, an example where making data available, you know, applies just a tiny bit more pressure on companies to actually do something about it. You will notice that, you know, things haven't really improved in a considerable manner. And so this is why we need an initiative like the Gender Identification Initiative to help us leverage data in order to apply pressure on the powers that be and the community itself. You know, each individual plays a role in ensuring change will happen. And, you know, use that data to demonstrate our point and move more quickly and more proactively through the solutions that we have available.
That's great. So one of the problems in having these conversations about putting gender as a data point is that lots of people are scared to actually make that public. They think that people don't want to identify by gender. And for Maxie and Andreea, I'm wondering, have you found that in your work? Do you find that people are reluctant to identify their gender when you ask them to as part of the work that you're doing? Maxie, sorry.
Shall I go first? Yeah.
Go first.
So individuals are not ever. I haven't in my 5 years at PRS Foundation. I haven't had any examples where, and we give 500 grants every year and have 10 times more applications, and all of those applicants submit gender information to us. It's the occasionally like the kind of organizations that we work with who work in countries where laws prevent asking protected information about protected characteristics, where people get a bit scared. And I think that I think it's a really important point that this isn't just for gender information to be made public. It's for monitoring purposes, to make sure that the structures within the music industry are not preventing people from progressing and existing in those spaces. So it's not just for consumers that we want to know this information. It's so that we can self-reflect, self-evaluate, and make sure that we're creating safe environments for all genders to flourish. So ultimately, it's to create a better industry that is more exciting, more diverse, and more accessible to everyone, as well as allowing consumers to kind of have a better, more efficient experience too. But for me, that's kind of a nice to have. The kind of the essential part is the safe environment.
The safe environment and the chance to be in the environment, you know,
exactly,
in a successful way, in a way that a creator can make a living. So Andreea, how about you?
I guess in my case, it's a little different because gender is, you know, what brings the SheSaidSo community together in the first place. But what I do come across a lot is an instance where women don't want to be recognized for their gender. They want to be recognized for their work. They don't want to be, you know, labeled as the female singer or the female DJ or the trans person and so on. They want to be appreciated and valued and paid equally for their work. And so this is where we, you know, things get a little weird, because on one side, us as women, we do want equal opportunity, but until we raise our voice about the fact that our gender, you know, prevents us from accessing equal opportunity, then automatically the gender conversation kicks off. And some solutions that are implemented, such as creating, you know, female focused playlists or female only lineups, or I don't know, initiatives where women, you know, their achievement is placed at the center of their gender. That's when there is, you know, a little bit of controversy, even amongst us women. Some appreciate the value that that sort of stuff brings. Like, for example, I heard on Spotify, ever since they created these playlists, or their Equal initiative, I think it's called, you know, consciously sort of promoting diverse talent, then the number of streams has also increased for a wider variety of artists, which obviously has a very direct implication on their income and their popularity and overall success. But at the same time, you know, you want to know that the reason for that is your art, not your gender. And so I completely understand people who come from that perspective, and I you know, have no judgment if there is an issue with that. However, at the same time, we need this identification in order to have data that then, you know, as per Maxie's statement, helps us create a safe environment and an equitable environment for everyone of all genders, of all backgrounds to flourish.
Exactly. You know, as I've been digging into trying to get this to happen, the conversations get more complicated, and they get complicated from everybody's perspective. So part of today's panel is to really start the conversation happening within the independent community, because I think most interesting change now in the business is coming from the independents. And Mark, Could you tell us a little bit about the adoption of the PI and MEAD standards? What is the feedback, and what kind of access are people really giving to gender identification on the master side through the DDEX standards?
Sure. Just before I answer that, I mean, I'm interested in both what Maxie and Andreea say on this front, that just to sort of relay some of the conversations that have been happening in DDEX around this whole area, that we chose to go down the self-identification route because, you know, some of the companies that are members of DDEX felt that getting it wrong was worse than not having the information in the first place. And so I sort of feel DDEX is sort of vindicated by the points that Maxie and Andreea have just been making, that it is about the individual, and it has to come from the individual, and then it filters through the value chain that way. On the specifics of PI and MEAD, they are both gradually being adopted. MEAD was only published 2 years ago, and thus the IT cycles that these companies work on is often 2 years at a time. So we are beginning to see implementations of MEAD coming through, and I think, you know, it will come down to if individual creators or whatever kind have insisted contractually that what they self-identify as should be a piece of data that is passed along the value chain, then that will start to filter through. PI is a lot more recent, probably less than a year ago, so it may be a while before we start to see, I'm sorry to use all these acronyms, that's terrible, you just get so used to it. Sorry about that. That'll take a while to filter through in terms of implementations, but the versions of MEAD that are being implemented actually carry party information as well at the moment. It's so that should still be available, but it is a slow process. I think the good thing about all of this is the point I was making earlier on, that the DSPs, the music services, are now desperate to get as much information about music as they possibly can, to improve the consumer experience and draw more consumers in, and thus encourage us to consume more music, and that obviously filters back to everybody as a benefit. So I think there's actually quite an interesting sort of, there's pressure coming from that side from the DSPs. There is also increasingly pressure coming from the creator community to collect data at source. So there's a number of initiatives that DDEX is associated with, which are very much about it sounds patronizing and it isn't meant to, but educating creators to make sure they capture this data as early in the process as they possibly can, so that it is available to be fed into the value chain. So we've got a sort of concertina effect occurring at the moment, which I think is really valuable. I mean, it's great for the here and now. It doesn't solve legacy data at all, but at least for the here and now, it means that we will start to capture this data because there's pressure from both sides. As somebody once said, metadata is a love letter to the future. So that's why we've got to capture it.
Yeah, well, getting creators to focus on data in general is sort of a torturous path. Yeah. At least on the publishing side, that's been my experience. As I meet, I'm sourcing songwriters all the time now for my company, and we meet a lot of DIY writers. And when I explain to them sort of how publishing works and where they need to be registered, they often look at me with like incredulous, like, you mean I have to do all that? Yeah. So adding gender that's sort of the other argument that people are throwing at us. Like, how could we possibly add gender when we're just trying to get songwriter names and artist names and producers and mixers and, the basic information. But I keep saying we can all walk and chew gum. It's a choice. So, we need to be better teachers on why the data is important and what we're going to do to educate, to be able to, without having the data, we can't make arguments about what's happening in the business. And the data gives us the proof of what is really happening. So Andreea, what kinds of things do you promote in SheSaidSo, having the members there make sure their data is fully engaged in all different aspects?
Well, we currently capture data about our members in a manual way. So it's a bit of a process. We definitely ask them, about their company location, but also things like ethnicity. They identify with sexual identity or preference. And again, we make those data points optional, reminding them that we want to capture this data in order to make sure that our own community is also inclusive, and that it, is intersectional is the word that we use. So ensuring that we address the needs of women of all backgrounds. And we know very well that some women are more privileged than others. Straight white women, if you look at the entire ecosystem, are probably the most privileged compared to women of other backgrounds. And so again, an instance where, it's extremely important for us to capture this data in order to reflect it back upon ourselves and make sure that we approach our work from a truly inclusive and intersectional place. And that's hopefully the future of this initiative as well. Just introducing gender as a data point in itself is a huge effort, but we, in an ideal world, would like to also introduce ethnicity or race, sexual preference, disabilities, all the different points that will truly help us make our efforts truly inclusive for everyone.
That is definitely our goal, but one step at a time. And the gender step is our first step. And we hope that you've learned a lot today, and you can start thinking about, adding gender, if you're on the master side, using the DDEX standards of Pi and Mead, not only for yourself, but particularly all the people involved in your project. And on the publishing side, we're still working on a solution for that, but there'll be more information rolling out over time. And we thank you for your time today and learning about the Gender Identification Initiative, and hope that you'll start watching out for it and talking about it amongst the creative community. Change happens when people get educated. So consider yourself being anointed for that education process and helping us get the message out. The gender is a very important data point that we all should be looking at, and that we need it in our system in order to create more diversity, equity, and inclusion.